We'll start with that. I'll introduce myself to you all. I am Dawn Rains. I'm the Chief Policy and Strategy Officer here at Treehouse. I've been at the organization 11 years, and in addition to my professional role, I'm also a former foster parent. So I'm just going to go around in the order I see people on the Zoom screen, but maybe I'll have Eileen introduce herself first.
Hi everyone, Eileen Graham. I'm the Director of Policy and Strategy at Treehouse, and I've been here for 6 years.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here with us today, and thanks for taking the time. So fun to have folks from all different sort of aspects of the Treehouse sort of universe of supporters, and really want to make this about what works, what questions you all have, and this is meant to be sort of a casual kind of lunch and learn session about what we do day to day during the session, the kinds of things that are coming up. Eileen, do you want to say anything else about sort of launching today?
I'd say as many questions as you have, please either ask them directly, throw them in the chat. We really want to tailor this to what you all want to know. Dawn and I can talk about it for a while, but we don't want to just talk at you. So really curious about what you want to know. We did kind of pitch it as, you know, how the legislative process works. You know, it can be a little inaccessible, I think, or seem inaccessible, and kind of want to dismantle that idea, make it so you can really feel like you can make your voice heard and support, since you're all interested in Treehouse, the issues that impact youth and foster care, as well as kind of like what Dawn and I do, or how to follow along and find something that you're interested in learning about. So I'm gonna leave it there.
Maybe we can just start by saying, just give you a tiny update. So far, Treehouse has provided testimony on about 11 bills so far this session. And 12, and signed in support as other or in opposition to another 40 or so. And we just gave some approval this morning, so it's probably closer to 50. It's the fourth week of the session, I think, and this Friday, or the 15th coming up, is what we call the first policy cutoff. So any new bill or idea that got introduced in this session has to make it out of its initial committee in order to continue moving on through the legislative process. So there's a little bit of a scramble this week as they try to hear all the bills that have been presented. Just something that's interesting about this session compared to previous years is that due to COVID-19 and the fact that the session is all virtual, they are hearing of a much reduced number of bills this session. They've really, their leadership of the legislature has asked folks to really focus on what is critical, and they're kind of big, 3 or 4 big themes for this year, including COVID-19 relief kind of writ large, either economic or health related. I would say racial equity writ large. We're seeing a large number of equity related things in the education space, in police accountability. We are seeing a lot related to the budget, although the budget is in better shape than it was certainly 6 months ago. We're not hearing talks of egregious cuts anymore, which is really exciting. So I see, Justin, you got a couple questions here.
Take them or leave them. I was just trying to stream of thought there.
Yeah. So when is the best time in the calendar to advocate? It really, really varies. We try not to, you'll know, many of you are probably signed up on our advocacy action tool. And we try not to ask the public to take action unless we really need folks to weigh in at the moment. And it depends also if it's a bill that is moving its way through the House and or the Senate, or if it's a budget request. So it kind of depends on the sort of throughout the course of the session. Eileen, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so that February 15th date Dawn mentioned as the key first cutoff that we see, we're keeping a really close eye on if we need to send an action alert about getting those bills out of committee. And as of the second, we think we're doing okay. We're going to be watching day to day to see if they get voted out of committee or not. And if there's a chance it doesn't, we'll probably do an action alert. But each of those key kind of milestones are really, really critical points. And when we do an action alert, you may or may not get it. Sometimes we tailor it to certain legislators that are on a committee. Sometimes for the bigger ones, like our big budget asks, we might do a bigger one to all the folks that have signed up because we need everyone in support or everyone voting on something. So it'll vary, I would say. I think a lot of the budget action alerts will come mid to end session when they're doing the final negotiations.
And then what's the best means to advocate? Email, website, call, visit. I think all of them are effective. I think there is one of the upsides, of course, of our Advocacy Action Center is that it allows a large number of people to take action on a particular issue very quickly. The downside is that legislators get a bunch of form emails because we pre-write the content for you. I would say if you want to make the most effective use of a tool like that, when you are notified that action needs to be taken, change the subject line and add a small anecdote about who you are and why you care about this issue. I think that toward the top, mostly legislators are basically tallying feedback from their constituents on particular, in favor or in opposition to a particular bill or budget line item request. But they are absolutely influenced by personal stories. And so the degree to which you can bring your experience into the conversation and how this really plays out in human lives, I think they pay attention to the data and they pay attention to the story, because I think otherwise they don't have any sort of window into that, right? So
I have seen them reference constituent stories on the floor when they're showing opposition or support, usually for a bill. They'll say, and I had a constituent who, it happens occasionally, or they'll use it in their conversations, making a decision about a bill.
Do you find that happens even when that goes through the advocacy tool or when it goes through their website? When I was in college, like a while ago, I was told, and there's been kind of a functioning principle of mine, like the more personal the contact, the more it counts. Like if I visit with somebody, they're going to count that more heavily than if I write them a handwritten letter, than if I write them an email, than if I write them something through a tool. Is that still generally the case? Like the more personal we can make it as far as time spent, like I would be willing to spend my time calling people instead of emailing if that would be counted worth more. But if it's the same, I can do a lot more with the email, because it's so quick and efficient in our tool.
Yeah, I do think the in-person visit is always the most powerful. And of course, you have limited bandwidth to do that. And also they have limited bandwidth as well.
Especially right now, it'll be very quick if you get a meeting.
I do think that one of the most effective things that you can do is get to know your legislators, because pretty soon after the second or third time you started to contact them, they'll start to identify and know who you are and the kinds of things that you care about, and the degree to which you can develop a relationship, I think the better. So I think that's just like a tip. I don't know if there is much difference between calling and writing a personal email, because most of the time when you call, you're going to get that person's legislative aid as opposed to them in person. And so I might prioritize personal emails. I do think going through the various tools, either the legislative website or or a tool like Treehouse's tool is probably again, that's sort of a step lower, but the degree to which you can personalize the email that goes, I think the better. So I think in terms of effectiveness. And in terms of the numbers of issues that you should be talking to you don't want to dilute your advocacy about the, containing 3, 4, 5, or 10 things. I mean, you probably don't want to contact them about everything, but you might, I would say 3 to 5 issues is totally fine. I mean, generally when my legislators see me coming, they know I'm coming to talk to them about foster care. that's Dawn. That's a foster care lady. But I do contact them about other things when they, things come up that I feel particularly passionate about. And also I intersections between issues. I care about criminal justice, I care about juvenile justice, and they are not disconnected from foster care, and why that's so critical in our state's responsibility to our most vulnerable citizens. So I try to connect.
And also on if you have a specific ask that you have, always mention the bill number and kind of know where it is in the process. It helps them to refresh their memory. There's a lot of bills on the table. And also then they can tailor in on, oh, this bill number, I had a constituent say this about it. It just helps them make that connection.
Yeah, we did have a legislator say it is a little annoying when I'm asked to support a particular issue that I'm the prime sponsor on,
Yeah, like, yes,
So,
of course they care.
Yeah, just to get to know.
Thank them for sponsoring it. Like, you might need to tailor your message.
And there's a super easy way on the legislative website, the Washington State Legislature website, to follow the progress of a bill. So you can kind of see who's sponsored it, what the language of the bill is. They do House bill reports and analysis reports that they give you a little bit of a sort of a Cliff Note version of what the bill actually does. And then, and also will summarize based after like the first hearing, any comments in favor of it or any comments against it. So you'll start to see who is weighing in on each side and why, and what the concerns are, if there are any suggested amendments or anything. It is not a totally intuitive process. And Eileen, I don't know if it's helpful.
Do you want me to pull up an example?
Yeah,
that justifies it. Yeah. So this bill I'm going to pull up on my screen is one that Treehouse is advocating for. Can you see this? So 5184. I can actually show you step by step. So if you go to the legislature's website, you go to bill information. There's a lot of different things you can pull. I just type in the bill number if I know it. And it takes me to the whole summary page. So it'll give you a really short description of what the bill is. The list of sponsors, this first one listed is what we call the prime sponsor. They're the one that introduced it. And then there's an opportunity for other legislators to sign on and show support. So that's everyone after the first name. The Senator Nobles is our prime sponsor. There's a little visual of where it is in the process. So you can see this one got all the way through the Senate and is now in the House. But there's also a detailed list, which is where I live in my day-to-day because I have to. It tells you on this date, here's what happened. Mm-hmm. So right now it's in the House and it was referred to the Education Committee today. And then document-wise, you can get into all sorts of things, but it'll have the bill itself, which is like line by line. Here's what they're suggesting be added in law or changed in law. And then these are the summaries that Dawn was referencing. So this would provide, once it loads, all that same information you had, and these bullet pointed things of what the bill does, which is really great if you don't want to read through, 2 to 30 pages of the actual bill, a quick summary, as well as additional information about the background of the issue and what the bill would do to change it. And then as public hearings happen and testimony is given, they'll add in summaries of what people said. So you can see staff summary of public testimony, and here we are, we signed in pro, so we're in the record. And it gets updated pretty regularly during session. Sometimes they lag a few days when it's really busy, but it's very helpful.
I'm seeing some additional questions in the chat. Can non-citizens sign in on bills? Yes, absolutely. And then do we advocate for the entire session once a bill passes the initial cutoff? You should just wait to see what happens. I will say it depends. We mostly do follow a bill all the way through the session, unless it gets changed in some way that we are not, today we were just saying, oh, we signed in favor of this bill. That's maybe a little further from our core agenda. In the policy committee, it's now in the fiscal committee. Should we weigh in and support again? And the answer is yes. Generally, it will be yes. There is a little bit of just waiting to see what happens too. I mean, there's also a little like just I am actually a lobbyist, a registered lobbyist for kids in foster care. There's a little bit of poking around in the background to find out more about like what are the objections if there is a legislator or more that have concerns about a bill. What are they? How is the prime sponsor proposing to address them? So sometimes there's a little bit of sleuthing we do in the background to figure out what direction something is going in the conversation. Because the other thing is you don't actually have access to, so in a policy committee, they hear the bill and they have public testimony. And then a few days later, they will do what they call an executive session where they consider the bill and vote on the bill that is not open to the public. And so you don't necessarily know what the conversation has been among legislators about the issue, about what the issues are. And so sometimes you have to do a little bit of background looking.
And Treehouse is part of a lot of different coalitions in the community, one major child welfare one, and then several education ones. So we're also talking to our colleagues about, oh, did you talk to so-and-so? What did you hear? What are the amendments or objections that are happening, so we can coordinate and get a better look across the board. It's not just Treehouse in one little corner. So
there's a question about when we send out an advocacy alert to specific on their district. So usually when you sign up for the tool, you put in your address so that we know what legislative district you're in. Do we let them know that they represent an important district for the issue at hand? And yes, sometimes we have the ability to send out an actual alert to all 800 plus people and that have signed. Sometimes we actually need just members of the House or the members of the Senate contacted, depending on where the bill is. Sometimes we need members of a particular committee contacted. Sometimes we need a single legislator contacted. We had an issue a couple of sessions ago. We were advocating for some additional funding for our driver's assistance program, which provides funding for driver's ed, for driver's licensing and car insurance for our youth who are still in foster care. And I needed people to contact the chair of the transportation committee. And he lives in Lake Stevens in one legislative district, and I needed him to be contacted by constituents. And so we're like, who do we know in this legislative district, and who could we activate? Because he needs to hear from the people that he is responsible to, that this is an important issue for him. So yes, oftentimes we'll say, your legislator is making an important decision on X, Y, or Z. So it kind of depends on what the issue is and what the decision point is. Is it helpful to know just very quickly the process that a bill goes through to become law? I know we're throwing around a lot of language here that is maybe, so a bill gets
the graphic.
Yeah, maybe it's always helpful, I think, to have the visual.
This is a Treehouse made one. There are all sorts of resources online I can throw in the chat too.
So up in the left corner, a bill is filed and it's assigned a bill number. It has to be proposed by a member of the legislature. So sometimes an organization like Treehouse could write a bill and contact legislators, a legislator or more, depending on the answer you get, about sponsoring, bringing a particular bill forward. That bill that Eileen just showed you, 5184, that school building points of contact for youth in foster care, is an idea that comes from Treehouse. It is a provision that is available currently. That exists for youth experiencing homelessness, and that we wanted it for youth experiencing foster care as well. So then if you go down the chart, it goes to first reading. It's referred to the appropriate committee. So oftentimes our bills go to either the education committees or the human services committees, depending on what the topic of the bill is, since we sometimes do things that are sort of focused on education or focused on foster care. So it gets assigned to a committee. It has its first reading. And then in the policy committee, they will do, sometimes they'll do a work session if they need to learn more about an issue, but mostly they do a public hearing where you have the opportunity to either come and make public comments or to sign in support or opposition or other, like, we generally like this bill, but we think an amendment is needed to address XYZ. And then after they hear the public hearing, a few days later, they schedule an executive session. And then it will, they vote it, they either do or don't vote it out of the committee. If that bill is going to cost the state money, then it goes to the appropriate fiscal committee. In the House, that's appropriations. In the Senate, that's Ways and Means. And they have to review it to see if it's going to move forward. We then again provide testimony sometimes that is actually about the cost of the bill, not the content of the bill, and why we think it's an important investment for the state to make. Then they will either vote it out or not vote it out. So it can die again here.
And there's a really important distinction here. So they could vote yes and pass it. They could vote no and say don't pass it, or it could not even get a vote. There's a lot of different steps. There could be too many priorities. There's a lot of steps where a bill could die along the way.
Yeah, it has to actually, the chair has to agree to actually place it on the agenda to actually even have a hearing. They don't have to place everything that comes before them for a hearing. There are committee chairs who rule a little bit with iron fists in some ways and don't like it when things come before their committee that they aren't expecting. I would say they're the exception rather than the rule, but it's helpful to know in terms of getting bills that we want introduced and passed. So after the fiscal committee, if they get it voted out, also if they vote it out, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're saying we're gonna pay for this. This is like, it's just, they're not gonna cause it to be a barrier in moving through the rest of the process. And then it moves to the rules committee. And the rules committee is where the leadership of that chamber decides whether or not they're going to hear it on the floor. So a lot of things can die here too. If they have too many things to vote on, too many bills to be heard, sometimes things will just not make the cut and things can die here. And then there's what they call a second reading where they hear it on the floor and they can make amendments to the bill on the floor of whichever chamber it starts out in.
And any member of the House or the Senate can make those amendments, whereas in policy committees, it's usually just members of those committees. So it kind of opens the issue up for more folks to propose changes.
And then they do the third reading, which includes any amendments, and then they vote on it on the floor of either the House or the Senate, depending which chamber the bill started out in. And then once it gets voted out of the originating chamber, then it gets sent over to the other side to go through the exact same process. So if our bill, for example, 5184 has passed out of the Senate and is now making its way through the House process. And so that bill is doing well in terms of making its progress. It's ahead. And then if the House has passed it all the way through and it gets all the way through that process in the Senate, then the Senate will vote on it. If there were any differences in the bills that came up through the processes, like if the Senate added some amendments, then they have to actually have what they call a conference to resolve any differences between the two versions. And then if they get through all that and they pass it out of the second chamber, or they get through the agreement, then they send it to the governor for his signature. And then the governor can decide whether or not to sign it or to veto it. So there's lots and lots of places the summary is there's lots and lots of places for bills to die. Eileen, I don't know if you've been monitoring the chat, if there's a way to go through questions that folks are asking.
I'm going to take down this graphic. I think we answered most questions, but let me know if there are other ones. Next up. Oh yeah, Laura, some legislators are hosting constituent coffees. Yes, that is true. They're doing virtual town halls as well. You can usually go online to find that information or reach out to the legislative assistant and they could direct you to when the next one is in your area. Kylie had a question. How do we focus our own efforts? You feel passionate about so many things, but don't want to dilute yourself from a legislative standpoint. That's a thing.
I think that is very similar to the question that that Justin asked earlier. I think you should weigh in with your legislators on things that you really care about. I mean, there's probably certainly things that you care about more than others, and you might prioritize. But I think your legislators, they work for you. They should listen to you about any issue you bring before them. It's hard to prioritize, and it's even hard for Treehouse. So, you know, we kind of work at this intersection of these two systems, the foster care system and the education system. And in any session, there could be hundreds of bills, you know, that could potentially fall into our area of interest. And we don't weigh in on everything related to foster care, although we probably have an opinion and think that things are good. Same thing on the education side. There's probably even more on the education side that we could weigh in on, and we don't choose to weigh in on everything. We try to kind of stay within our sort of legislative, you know, sort of framework priorities, mostly due to when we weigh in, we want our voice to matter, and also there are things that legislators would naturally expect Treehouse to be sort of the lead organization or to weigh in on. And those are the places we absolutely want to show up. We also have just limited capacity, just in terms of, I can't track hundreds and hundreds of bills. And so we got to pick our spot, right? Like, let's focus on these 25, you know? That's why we set a legislative agenda and try to have created some parameters around what we really care about.
And Kylie, I'm seeing your follow-up. I think you can find advice online. Eventually, our dream is to build out kind of a advocacy 101 toolkit about, you know, what are the best ways to advocate? Like, you know, is there a certain structure that Dawn mentioned with data and stories or that kind of thing, just to give folks a starting point? But you can find some resources online about how to make a compelling case, or what's the best technique for contacting a legislator.
Mm-hmm.
Laura had a question. Could you share more about the importance or process of connecting new legislation with the state's budget? Some bills pass into law but are never funded, which especially happened last year.
Yeah, yes. It is something you're prepared when you're proposing a new bill. How much is this going to cost? And also, you're not the one who gets to say how much it's going to cost. So when a bill is proposed, then it goes through an official process at the state agency that would be overseeing it, and they have to do an estimate of how much it would cost. You want to be really clear, as clear as you can be in the language, to help inform the assumptions that they might be making. Because if a bill gets a really big fiscal note, then it becomes much, much more difficult to pass. And one of the big questions around our school building points of contact is, what is the fiscal note? Is it, you know, an unfunded mandate? Is there going to be funding for additional staff? And the answer is no. It is largely an unfunded mandate. It is sort of formalizing the process that that Treehouse usually does when we move into a new school building, is really identify that human being, that adult human being in that building who really cares about our kids and is willing to keep an eye on them. In most school buildings, there's anywhere between 1 and 10 youth in foster care. So it's not something that would require, you know, probably an additional full-time staff person to track. And so that's why you'll see the fiscal note is negligible. I think it's actually 0. Also, anything that comes in below $70,000 doesn't have to go through the fiscal committee. Like, that's, I guess, pocket change or rounding error or in the state budget. So they don't actually have to take it through the fiscal committee. So sometimes that'll be like, oh, can we keep this fiscal note under a certain dollar amount?
And in bills, so if a bill has a dollar amount tied to it, just because it makes it through the process doesn't mean it'll end up in the final budget. The final budget negotiations kind of happen when they see everything that's on the table. So they see all the bills, what they're going to cost, and there's, you know, some items that are just dollar amounts. So that's when that final negotiation happens. And a lot of times in bills, they can have language that says, like, as I don't remember exact language, but like basically as funding is allocated, like if there's money available, this needs to be implemented, saying, we know you can't do it without these dollars, and the dollars may not be there in the final budget. So that happened actually to a bill we really liked last year. And then COVID happened and they didn't have available resources to implement it.
Mhm. I think we've gotten all the questions that are currently in the chat. Do folks have other questions?
Kylie, I don't think we're connected with them directly, but I know there was a bill introduced or passed about traumatic brain injuries for youth in foster care.
I was just curious, I think it's one of those intersections where, having like parents and a family and like a really established for children is kind of like how they get picked up when it comes to brain injury. And so I feel like with foster children, like there's that real risk of them just like falling through the cracks or not, being seen. And I was just curious if you guys were kind of affiliated or aware of them. They're just doing a lot of work in our state for schools and educators. But I was curious if they were kind of connected to someone like you guys who's working like with foster children.
We haven't been working with them directly. Eileen, did that bill that Representative Corey sponsored last year?
Now.
Yeah, did it get? I think that it passed. I don't know if it was one of the things that was in the that ended up sort of falling by the wayside because of like funding was cut by the governor when COVID when he did that first round of cuts in June or July.
And it was going to be for any youth coming into care. That was the proposal, that they get evaluated for brain injury.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because there's a thought that there's a lot of undiagnosed traumatic brain injuries for youth in foster care.
It's going to take me a second. I'll look.
Thank you.
While I'm looking, Julie, does Treehouse ever partner with child placing agencies for advocacy? Yes, they're part of the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition that we work with really closely. We call them QUAC, that's the abbreviation. I don't think we do one-on-one, but they're parts of groups that we are in contact with regularly.
Yeah, Treehouse is a part of a lot of advocacy sort of coalitions. There's only one on the child welfare side called the Child Welfare Advocacy Coalition, made up over 100 organizations that are focused on kids and youth experiencing foster care. And then there are a bunch on the education side, and particularly since COVID hit, and there's a lot of push around reimagining the way public education happens. And so several colleagues that we work with on a really regular basis, and then coalitions of colleagues. That is a big chunk of how we spend our time through session is weekly meetings with the coalition so that we know about all the progress that is happening on all of the things that we care about. We are part of adopting shared legislative agendas for each of those coalitions that we're a part of as well. So things might not specifically show up on the Treehouse legislative agenda, but they're on this coalition's agenda, and we might sign in support of some of those the items that are not at the core of our specific agenda. So there's a tremendous amount of partnership work. Also, Treehouse is co-leading with our colleagues at Building Changes. So if we are the statewide organization focused on the educational needs of youth experiencing foster care, Building Changes is a statewide organization focused on the educational needs of youth experiencing homelessness. And we together are leading a project that we call Project Education Impact. It is a collaboration of 6 state agencies and entities, 7 statewide nonprofit organizations, 4 legislators, 1 from each of the 4 corners of the legislature, And our goal together is to achieve educational parity for kids in foster care, kids experiencing homelessness, all the way from pre-K through post-secondary. And so we've written reports to the legislature together. We've adopted shared legislative agenda for the first time this year. And we talk about these students as highly mobile students. They have, the two populations experience very similar educational conditions and very similar educational outcomes. The policy and programmatic levers that we have to pull are a little bit different for each of the populations, but that is one. Building Changes is one of the colleagues we work with the most closely on legislative issues, on advocacy with. It's actually not just with the legislature. It's also, we're advocating with the governor's office. We're advocating with the superintendent of public instruction, with the secretary of the Department of Children, Youth, and Families. And so advocacy does look like legislative policy and budget, but it also looks like, how is that law being implemented? We have a lot of really great law in this state around education for youth in foster care, but a lot of it hasn't been implemented very well on the ground. It's very hard for caseworkers to uphold the practice that will help keep youth in their school buildings of origin when they come into foster care if they've never been trained on it and don't know what the legal requirements are, which is actually what is happening right now in our state. And so then the advocacy really becomes advocacy with the state agency to do their job better. We are in deep partnership with both of the state agencies, in addition to being contractors with the state agencies for the education program work that we do. I just came from a call right before this one, negotiating our educational advocacy contract for the next 2 years with our state agencies. Let's see if there's other questions. Maybe I could do a little quick update on our legislative agenda for this year and what's happening. We are super excited. I think you all are probably aware of our graduation success work, where we are providing basically wraparound support services to high school age youth in foster care. Our Treehouse education specialists work with youth weekly. We are currently serving about 1,300 students in that program, and there are about 600 students left to serve in our state. And we are making the sort of equity argument that, these are the young people furthest from educational opportunity and justice, and we have an intervention that works. And we need to, the state, these are the kids for whom the state has stepped in to become parent. And that we should fund this really critical support to our youth in foster care statewide. So Senator Carlisle, who has long been our champion, has agreed to champion not a $2 million request, which was originally on our legislative agenda, but a $5 million request over the next 2 years. Treehouse would match that with another $1 million support to extend graduation success statewide and really serve every youth who wants that service. We think that we are currently serving between 75 and 80% of the students in the areas and the school districts that we're currently serving. So we have very high saturation rates. So we're excited about that ask, and there'll be a lot of advocacy coming up in the very near future. We're currently meeting with legislators, getting all of our sort of supporter ducks in a row. And then we'll start to do public advocacy with the rest of the legislature to say yes to this request. So that's a big one. The other request that we have in the legislature is our driver's assistance program. The funding that we receive from the state actually comes out of the transportation budget, which seems sort of odd, but they are highway safety dollars. The theory is that when our young people in foster care don't take driver's ed and don't have car insurance, that they cause a hazard not only to themselves, but to many other people on the roads, and that we don't want, either sort of a financial spiral to happen for them if they get pulled over without having that a driver's license or insurance, or any tragedies to happen. And actually the chair of the committee, the House Transportation Committee, is actually very concerned about the high level of fatality accidents for youth under 25. And he thinks about this as kind of meeting that, addressing that need. So we're currently serving just under 700 students in that program. There are about 1,700 eligible statewide. And so we're asking for another $450,000 over 2 years just to help meet the very, very long wait list that we have for that service. So.
And from the Treehouse end, we know that especially for providing financial support for car insurance is a huge help to our young adults who are transitioning in independence. I mean, you all probably have that. It's very costly, especially for those who are younger. And so we've heard directly from young people that, you know, it helps them make a decision between, you know, buying food or paying for rent when they get this additional support from Treehouse. So we really see it as key to helping us with that transition to independence goal that we have as an organization.
You'll be interested to know that only about 60% of young people get their driver's licenses before 18 in the general population. Only about 3% of students in foster care get their driver's license before 18. And this is a really critical sort of, like as Eileen said, a transition to adulthood strategy. I see a couple questions. How often do we hold these meetings? This one is the first time we did one of these lunch and learns a couple weeks ago, just for our internal sort of folks, staff, board, and advisory board, ambassador board. So these we hold occasionally, but we actually have a call every 2 weeks. 2 weeks, Eileen?
Yes, 2 weeks with our committee and
different calls that are on different frequencies, which one's which, where we do a quick check-in with our policy and advocacy committee of the board, and also we have a policy and advocacy staff team of folks who are really interested in these issues that you all would be more than welcome to attend. We just go quickly through all of our legislative priorities and the bills and where they are and what advocacy is needed. They're 30 minutes and they move along at a pretty fast clip. So if you're interested in joining, we'd love to have you for that.
And I'll send that link out. I need to figure out the best way to do that, but I'll send it to anyone who's on this call.
And then how can I continue to learn how to advocate for Treehouse? I think the one great way is, of course, to sign up for our online advocacy action tools, because when we need folks to weigh in, when we need advocates to really weigh in with their legislators, we make a public call for that. And it's a super easy way, really takes about a minute, maybe 2 minutes if you spend some time personalizing it. So it's a easy way to stay kind of up to date. And a question about, do you set your legislative agenda a year in advance or 2 years in advance? That's a really great question. Actually, we set it every year, and we would probably always update it every year depending on what issues are emerging. But we are looking towards setting kind of a long-term policy vision, like where are we trying to get to over the long term, and what might we do this session to move toward that. There is a natural 2-year cycle because of the biennium budget. So this year is a long session, 105 days, where the legislature sets its budget for the next 2 years. And then this next year's session will be only a 60-day session where they just do a supplemental budget. So it's much less involved budget process. So there is a little bit of a natural 2-year cycle.
I'd say part of that long-term arc that we want to be talking about is it can take several years for an issue to get through, to get buy-in, to get things resolved. And so we haven't had a lot of capacity to do this. Our team's been growing a lot over the last few years. But being able to do that is going to help us identify, who we need to be talking to when, not just legislators, but all the state agencies that Dawn mentioned, to make things really successful in getting through and changed. So it's kind of that multi-year strategy that we're going to be developing over the next probably 9 months.
Mm-hmm. And ideally that we do some really good work with our state agency partners and our nonprofit colleagues, that we're collectively trying to define sort of a vision of where we're trying to go.
Not everything has to be law. That's one thing too. It's one strategy, but not everything needs to go through a session. So what are those other strategies that we can use?
in fact, we probably want to start with like, is there a way to solve this issue without having to create a bill or to lobby for more support? And this question about, do you help in evaluating policies that may have been passed but have implementation issues? I would say yes, absolutely. There's not a formal evaluation process. So really where it comes from, is we have 55 education specialists and 13 educational advocates out there working with 2,500 kids statewide. And so we are seeing on the ground level where things are not working, which is how we know, for example, that caseworkers are not getting training about best school placement determination law and putting into place and so now the question is, how do we resolve that? Do we go to DCYF and say, look, we can tell from this data or from this feedback that this law is not being implemented appropriately. Is there something we can do to work together to improve that? Can we offer training? Can we be a resource of support in some way? Or do we need to go to the legislature and mandate it? And they would really rather us not mandate it if at all possible. And luckily we have such great relationships now that that we can oftentimes advance things outside of that formal process, which is much, much better for kids and actually makes things happen much more quickly. But sometimes they'll actually say, it would actually help me to have this in law. Could you pursue this or could we do this together? But I think we do ask ourselves that question. And Laura, your question, is there one thing you can do to support Treehouse priorities? I would say sign up for the Advocacy Action Center because we're about to launch all of our advocacy efforts regarding our budget requests. And the event on March 17th, that's our annual Champions Luncheon. This is where we gather the entire Treehouse community. So we do have opportunities for table captains because it's virtual this year. So to gather friends and colleagues to come to the luncheon and hear more about Treehouse's work. And this is one of our key fundraising opportunities for the year. And this is absolutely something that I don't know how you say the acronym, but BIAWA can participate in and support. We would love that. That would be so awesome.
It's also a new opportunity because it is virtual this year. It's not being hosted in Seattle, to get folks statewide to join us who may care about these issues that, the drive was not possible before.
I would also say because Treehouse has historically been the greater Puget Sound region, over 30 plus years, and our statewide expansion has really happened over the last 7 to 10 years, that our advocates are also highly concentrated in the Puget Sound region, which means they're almost entirely represented by Democrats. And foster care is a bipartisan issue. I actually had a Republican senator tell me this morning that she wanted to sign on to our graduation success request. Super exciting. So we need people from all over the state represented by every political stripe of person to really weigh in about issues that impact our kids. And so if you have folks who live across the state who you think would be interested in these issues, we would love to have them sign up for the Advocacy Action Tool and to stay on top of issues that impact our young people. So I would say that's another thing you could, you'll always see also on our social media feeds that when we do advocacy action alerts, we almost always post about them on social. And so it's something you can do is just share that with friends and family. It's super quick and easy for them to click on the link, take action in a minute. And that's another way that you can make sure that everyone is sort of raising their voice. Kylie is saying, do you have staff available to do training for other nonprofits always looking to be educated? I think we could certainly do that probably outside of session. And we actually do have materials and stuff that we have developed that we've used for training for our staff team and for our committee. So it actually would not be a tremendous amount of work for us to do that. We'd be happy to provide information and and training on all of these issues. And I think there are ways for nonprofits to really dip their toe in the water. You don't have to go all in with a, a paid lobbyist and someone who's assigned to do this work every day. I think there are really impactful ways to kind of start to go in this direction that don't take a lot of resource. So be happy to advance that. Yeah, Boulder Advocacy has some really great tools about what is allowable for nonprofits. How can you make sure you're not jeopardizing your 501c3 tax status, nonprofit tax exempt status? There are a couple of things that you absolutely cannot do, like
endorsing a candidate. Yeah, that's the big one that comes up every year.
Yeah, but you can always take a position on a bill or an issue that's coming up. So it's a good to make sure you're operating within the legal bounds of grassroots advocacy and lobbying. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Hopefully it was helpful and educational, and love any thoughts you have about other things you'd like to learn about. We can continue to do these kind of informal sessions, answer questions that you might have. Invite you all to kind of follow along with our legislative agenda this year and see how we do. And thanks so much for all you do for Treehouse. We are a community that is strong because of so many different voices and perspectives. And so thank you so much for all you do for Treehouse and also for our kids. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, Dawn. Thanks, Eileen.
Thank you.